A term that gets thrown around when it comes to game design is elegance. And to me, an elegant game is one where the experience of playing the game is greater than the sum of its parts, of its rules and its components. And both the rules and the components have to be designed perfectly, so both their form and their function work in unison to provide a satisfying experience. But how do you actually go about designing elegant games? In this video, I'm going to share some of the ways I approach designing games for elegance and try and do more with less. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a full-time board game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world. On this channel, I like to talk about all things game design, from my experiences in the industry to tips and tricks to help first-time designers improve their craft. There isn't one way to approach designing elegant games, and in fact there's not really one definition of what an elegant game really is. But these are some ideas that might help you get closer to something that might be considered elegant, and tips to design for maximum functionality but with minimum rules and components. And at the very start you might ask, why bother trying to do this? One thing is that designing games with fewer rules is a great advantage when it comes for new players to learn them. In the current environment where there are so many different games released, the ones that succeed tend to give a great experience to players even on their first play. And in order to do that, their rules need to be easily digested by those players and easy to learn. Also, working with a game with fewer components is a lot easier in terms of iterating. There's fewer things that you have to make every time you make a new version of a prototype, and there's just fewer things you have to design in the first place. So it can be a great advantage when you're starting out in game design, because it makes that process of playtesting and iterating just that more easier because you've got less things going on in the game. And one of the other advantages of elegant games is that they really provide an interesting challenge for you as a game designer, and can provide really interesting constraints that can help you through that beginning phase with a new game and getting it to the table all that much quicker. So let's move on to some of the ways that you can look to design elegant games. Utilize emergent complexity. The idea of emergent complexity is where you can have a number of simple components that have simple rules about how they function, but when they start to interact with each other, they can give very complex and rich behavior. In game terms, this means that you can define some very easy game pieces or mechanisms to your game, and the depth of the game can come with all the different ways those pieces can interact with each other, all the different ways in which they can come up in a game. That might all sound a little bit theoretical, but I'll talk about a few examples. The first type of mechanism that I think illustrates emergent complexity is that of card flipping in flip and write games such as Next Station London or the Guild of Merchant Explorers. In both of these games, there's a small deck of common cards that the players will use to determine what they're going to do on their turn. Every turn, the top card of that deck is revealed, and then all the players do the action as depicted on the card. In Next Station London, the card depicts a shape, and that determines which station you're going to try and connect to on your turn. And in the Guild of Merchant Explorers, the card determines which types of spaces you can explore that turn. In each case, the rules surrounding each individual card are very simple and easy to understand, and they're compartmentalized to do the single same thing every time they're drawn. So this all seems fairly straightforward, but the complexity comes from the fact that that deck is shuffled every time, and the order in which those cards are drawn is different. This is the first part that gives emergent complexity to this type of design. But the second part you need is that the order in which those cards come out, and therefore the order in which you take those actions, has to matter. It has to give a different result if you draw them in a different order. And both these games, which are effectively route building games, do that. For example, consider Next Station London. In the first card I draw is a square, and I connect to a square station. On the next turn, I draw a triangle, and now the stations that I can connect to is different from where I started at, because I'm now at a different station that I can branch off onto. If I'd switched the order of those cards drawn, a triangle and then a square, I would have different results. And the same is in the Guild of Merchant Explorers. Because you're only allowed to explore spaces that are adjacent to spaces you've already explored, the order in which you get those exploration cards is very important. I might draw and explore 3 C spaces in a straight line first, and I'll use that to explore C spaces, and then that might open up a new mountain territory for when I draw an Explore Mountain card later on in the round. If I'd drawn that Explore Mountain card before I got the Explore C card, then I wouldn't have been able to access those mountains on a different island. And I've used the same idea in other route building games I've designed with random inputs, most notably in the games we've made for Postmark games like Voyages and Waypoints. In both of these games, you're moving around a map from point to point, and you're using die rolls to effectively determine what you can do on each turn. And because every turn, the position you're moving from is different, even if you're given the same random input, you have a different set of choices. And as you play the game, the results of these choices offers up a large possible number of different outcomes. And you can see that, for example, in Next Station London. All the players will start with the same map and will have the same draw of the cards, but they'll produce completely different maps based on the decisions that they've made and the fact that they're working on different lines in different rounds. I would say there are two main things to think about if you want to employ this type of emergent complexity in your own game designs. The first is you want some form of randomness in the game. The randomness ensures that you're going to have a different set of results to work with and to make choices about in every single game, and that gives you the variety you want. And the second part is that you want the choices that you make in the game, the different actions you do on each turn, to have some sort of memory to be influenced by decisions you made previously to that point. If all the actions are completely independent of each other, and the result of an action isn't affected by anything you've done before, then you're not going to have any emergent complexity, because it won't matter in which order you take the actions if they're always effectively the same. But thinking about ways for previous actions to influence future actions will give you the desired effect and give you a richness of the outcomes that you can have in your game. The reason I mentioned this idea in a video about elegant designs is that you can especially employ this idea by having very, very simple actions with very easy rules to understand how to do them, but by having this random order in which they come out, and by having the results of previous actions influence future ones, you can have a very rich, rewarding experience without it being very complex or complicated to understand. Get the most out of your components. The previous point we talked about mechanisms, but now let's think about components when trying to design an elegant game. One way that you can minimize the number of components you need in the game is to make sure that the components you do include serve the greatest function that they can. And a great way to do that is to ask a component to do multiple jobs. In the game of Skull, each player has 4 coasters, circular tiles, at the start of the game, and they're the same for each player, 3 flowers and 1 skull. And each round, one player is going to effectively lose one of their tiles. Losing a tile, losing this one component, does 2 things. Firstly, it restricts the choices a player has on future rounds. If you get rid of your skull, then you no longer have the option to play a skull on a future turn. But in addition to this, it tracks a player's life. When a player is reduced to 0 tiles, then they're out of the game. So the coasters not only determine what a player can do in the game, but they also determine their life or their score effectively. That component is doing double duty. Any game which uses cards in your hand as currency is also a great example of using components in multiple ways. And an example of that is Race for the Galaxy. Every card in your hand can either be played for what's on the card, or it can be used to pay the cost of playing other cards in your hand. So instead of needing a separate component to represent money, for instance, you can use the cards that you already have in the game to represent that. Another great example is in Dropolter. Sorry if I butchered how you pronounce that game, which is a dexterity style of game where you're holding a number of objects in your hand, and every turn a card is revealed, and you have to be the quickest to just drop the objects on the card before anyone else. And you have to do this with only one hand, the hand that you're holding all the objects in. And if you succeed in a round, then you take a small bell and add it to the objects you have in your hand. Bells are effectively points, and you win the game once you get 5 bells. But on a future round, when you're trying to drop items from your hand, if you drop a bell, then you effectively lose a point. So this one component, the bell, is both a score mechanism and it adds extra complexity to the task you have to do every turn. And what's more, it's a fantastic balancing mechanism, because as you get more bells in your hand, i.e. doing better in the game, it gets harder and harder not to drop one of them when you're trying to drop other things from your hand. Dropolter, and in fact a lot of the Oink games, I think are masterclasses in elegant design, and especially getting the most out of every component, because they're making games in such small boxes, such that the few components they do get to use in the game have to be used to the utmost extent that they can. And one last example from one of my own games is my game Spy Connection, where players have this resource of spies, which are just small discs, but they can be used in multiple different ways in the game. You place spies on routes to claim them, to be able to travel from place to place. You place spies on contract cards to both reserve them and to show which cities you've already visited on that card. You're trying to visit all the cities on the card to complete it. And because you have only a fixed pool of spies, you have to balance where you're going to employ the spies, whether you have them out on routes or on cards in front of you. And it leads to some interesting tension in the game. If you have a lot of spies out on the board, you have a fantastic network that makes it very easy to travel from place to place. But you can't have many contracts you're working on, making yourself less efficient. Whereas if you have more contracts that you're working on, and maybe you're trying to get contracts which have the same location, which you can fulfill at the same time, it means necessarily you'll have fewer agents to be able to use out on the board to be able to travel more effectively. So from this simple component of about 15 wooden discs that every player has, you produce a lot of interesting gameplay and tension about how to use them most effectively. And once you have this idea in mind when you're designing a game, you can start to look at the components you're using and ask yourself, Can this component be doing more than just a function it's already doing in the game? Have choices affect both you and your opponents? When you're thinking about trying to have a minimal rule set, one way to achieve this is to make sure that the rules you do have, the actions you do have in the game, serve double duty. We just talked about components doing double duty, but how can actions or mechanisms in your game do double duty? In a lot of games, when you take an action, you want to do something that's good for you. You're thinking about what's best for you. But other actions, you're thinking about how can I affect my opponent? How can I affect the choices they're going to make? How can I make it harder for them to do well in the game? If you're able to design a single action that does both of those things at the same time, then you're going to be able to achieve that with fewer rules, and therefore have a more elegant design. For me, Azul is one of the greatest examples of this. In Azul, on your turn, you're going to take all the tiles of one color in a particular location. And this can be either one of the circular factory tiles or the middle space in between those tiles. The important part for this discussion is when you take tiles from one of those circular factory tiles, all the tiles that you don't take, i.e. of the colour that you didn't choose, go into the middle of the table to be possibly taken by other players on a future turn. This means that every action you take, you're not only determining what tiles you get, but you're changing the set of options for the next players in what tiles they can take. Because not only now can they not take tiles from the circular factory tile which you chose from, but they now have a new option of tiles that they can take from the middle of the table. And if there were already tiles in the middle of the table before you took your action, you've now added more tiles in the middle of the table, maybe meaning that they can take more tiles of a particular colour than they could have taken before. And because the way that scoring works in Azul is so exact that you might want exactly a certain number of tiles, and having fewer or more can be detrimental, this mechanism where you change the number of tiles players are choosing from on future rounds can have really important ramifications. And again, the important thing is, in the rules, there's just one action. It describes the one thing you do on a turn. But the effect of that action is to determine both what you get and to change what your opponents can get on their turn. Not only does it mean there are fewer rules in the game, it means this one rule both determines your own strategies through the game, what tiles you're going to take, but it also can be used to determine what tiles are available to your other players. So players are able to play on different levels of the game. Maybe when you start to play Azul, you're only worried about what you're going to take on your turn. You don't really care about how that's going to influence your opponents, and you can play it perfectly well that way, because you only have to understand that core action. But later on in the game, as you get better in the game, you might start trying to balance both what you're taking and what you're making available to your opponents. And thus an added bonus of this kind of design is that it can produce a really rewarding learning curve in the game, where the game is easy to approach and learn on the first play, but offers ways to get better at the game as you get more familiar with the systems as you play more games. My game My Shelfie does this as well, where there's a central board of tiles that you're going to be taking from every turn. Every tile you take has to have at least one edge open at the start of your turn. And of course, as you take tiles, you're going to change which tiles are open for the next player to take. Again, that one action determines both what you get and what other players can get on a future turn. So if you can think about designing actions in your game, which do both things at once, both influence your own state and what other players can do, you're going to get more done in your game with fewer rules. And thus potentially have a more elegant design. Use negative space in your games. One way to do more with fewer components is to make not only the presence of a component have some meaning in the game, but also the absence of that component important. This can be especially important in games which have a spatial aspect, like a map or tiles arranged next to each other. A great example of a game like this is Hey, That's My Fish, where at the start of the game you have many hexagonal tiles all joined to each other with different amounts of fish. And on your turn you're going to move one of your penguins in a straight line until it hits a gap in the display of tiles, the edge of the tiles, or another penguin. And then you take away the tile that you were standing on at the start of your turn into your own collection, and you're trying to get the most fish. But importantly, now that you've removed that tile from the board, there's now a hole in the board, which means it's going to change how other penguins are going to move around the board on future turns. It creates a new obstacle that's going to block players' movement. And as the game goes on, you might find that your penguins are completely isolated on a small set of ice floes that are completely disconnected from a larger board, and they're never going to be able to escape. At most, they're going to be able to collect a few tiles in that small collection that's been separated. It's a great example where both having a tile in a place, but also having an empty space where a tile used to be, is important for how the game works. You're using both the presence and the absence of a component in a meaningful way. My game Costa Rica is somewhat similar to this. Again, you have a map of hex tiles, and over the course of the game you're going to be removing some of those tiles, and just like in that Hey, That's My Fish, you can get groups of your explorers which can be completely cut off from the main map of tiles, and therefore restricted in what tiles they can claim on their turn. And while this idea is especially well suited to games with some sort of spatial aspect, it can be employed in other games as well. Imagine if you have a card display with 5 cards, and the cost of taking a card from that display is the number of cards in that display after you take a card. So when you take the first card, there are now 4 cards left in the display, and that means the card you took costs 4. And of course it means taking the final card in that display will be free. You're using the fact of whether a card is there or not to influence the price that players are going to have to pay, without needing some other way to track that price. You're using the presence and the absence of that card to be important. Minimize rules to maximize player creativity. Sometimes elegant games can be a little bit different in that they can provide a minimal framework for players to play within and effectively create rules of their own. In this way, the richness and complexity of the game is somewhat created by the players themselves when they play the game, rather than the rules determining what they're able to do in the game. One family of game that does this especially well are games with limited communication, where the game has some very simple rules about how you're limited and how you can communicate with each other, and then it's left up to the players to come up with their own rules around those restrictions in order to be able to communicate effectively with each other. A great example of that is the mind, which is just a very simple rule where you can't talk to each other about what's in your hand, and that leaves the players a very open space to be creative in ways in which they try and communicate what cards they have, whether that's through movement, body language, eye contact, a sense of pace and timing. You can create such tension and a varied set of experiences in the mind with just that one simple rule about not being able to talk about what's in your hand. In terms of component providing this freedom for players to be creative in a game and create their own rules, the best example I have is the red pawn in Magic Maze. Magic Maze, like the Mind, is a cooperative game with limited communication, and much like in the Mind, in Magic Maze, you can't talk to each other about what you're doing on your turn. What you're trying to do is collectively control a set of adventurers going through a maze, with the added restriction that each player can only move the adventurers in one of the cardinal directions, or potentially a couple if you're playing with fewer players. So I might only be able to move an adventurer due north, and you might be only able to move an adventurer east. And we have to kind of work out with each other to move that adventurer in concert. If we're trying to do a zigzag, I might have to move the one, then you move the one, then I move the one, then you move the one. And we have to get in a kind of a rhythm to do that quickly, because the whole point of the game is to move these adventurers through the maze to a set time limit. And already the limited communication provides a lot of scope for creativity in the ways that we're going to work with each other and work out how best to work with each other without talking. But then you add the red pawn, which is just a simple big red pawn, nothing more, which in the rules is simply referred to as the do something pawn. And all it says in the rules is if you want a player to do something, if you want them to move an adventurer in the direction that they're able to do, then you can just take this pawn and put it in front of them. And that player might not agree with your assessment of the situation and can move it back to you. It's completely free about how it moves around the table. And that very simple rule about just simply placing the pawn in front of someone, trying to get their attention to do something, creates the most hilarious moments and perhaps the absolute personification of passive aggression in a game that I've ever seen. It could be really hilarious in the number of different ways this pawn can be used. It could be just placed helpfully in front of a player to try and guide them with maybe what they're doing. Sometimes it can be slammed in front of someone if you really want them to do something and you're frustrated with them. Maybe they're going to be frustrated with you and they'll slam it back in front of you. Such a simple component and a simple way it can be used can create such variety and richness in gameplay. And that's elegance. So this outlines another way you can approach designing elegance in your game, is finding ways that players can introduce their own creativity and thoughts into the game, giving them a framework that's just enough to create interesting situations for them then to inject their own ways of playing, their own rules, that can then function and provide different gameplay experiences. So those are some ideas I have about designing elegant games. And in fact, even if you're not really worried about elegant games, hopefully there's some ideas in here that might spark something for your own game designs. And as always, these are not prescriptive, just simply take what works for you and discard the rest. What do you think about elegance in game designs? And what do you think are some great tips towards trying to design for elegance? I would love you to leave your thoughts down in the comments below. And again, we can share different ways we think about elegance and hopefully find ways to make our games do more with less. But until next time, thanks very much for watching and all the best with your game designs. Bye.